My journey actually started with the Mars journey for high-performing teams almost 10 years ago when we, as a business, invited the Gutman Development Strategies Group to come into Hackettstown. Paul Michaels was then running the North American chocolate business. I think Bob Gamgort was about to come in, but at any rate, we recognized the need for some serious work, especially with our senior teams. And I happened to be fortunate enough to be working in what was the learning function within our part of the business back then. And I was asked to coordinate some of these large sessions where we brought in lots of people. I worked very closely with Gutman Development Strategies, and our group within P&O at that time did a couple of team sessions with them. And so I began to observe. I took a lot of notes, which I still have, and tried to understand what is it we mean by high-performing teams from the inside out, if you will, from the facilitator's perspective. That's always been my role, even though in these cases I was often either on the team that was being worked with or coordinating the function. So it started with that. That's when my awareness grew. And here and there, I'd be asked to come in and do some similar things. And so I used these frameworks. And I was very clear with the folks from Gutman that I wanted to learn. And they were really generous in helping me in this. Along the way, we developed a program called Leading High-Performing Teams for Mars University. This was built on the same fundamental models and concepts as the actual intact team workshops we call team alignment sessions. Used a couple of additional models. I went through that. I was trained as a facilitator. I was later certified. So I had all this background in that approach. And it was doing really, really well. I mean, this was 2007, 2008, and there was a lot of demand. And frankly, there was so much demand, we couldn't really meet it. I was asked in 2008 if I would consider joining Mars University. At that time, I was part of North America Chocolate, and some restructuring was going on. So I said, sure, let me try it. And they asked me to focus on high-performing teams. I sat down with the folks at the Gutman Development Strategies Group. I let them know what I was doing. I said, I think your frameworks are terrific. I want you to know I've been certified in leading high-performing teams. I'd like to use these. They said, fine. And we struck a deal, and I went to work within a matter of weeks. So July of 2008, I started making my living by working with teams, primarily in North America, as was the intention. And that began a journey. One of the things we agreed I would not do in exactly the Gutman way was gather data on teams. Every team session involves tailoring that session to the team through gathering some information from individual team members up front, usually via interviews. In order to have a distinct approach, I developed a set of questions. And I can't remember, I think there were 20 questions originally, and then I would follow up with a very open-ended sort of interview. What's best about your team? What do you think needs work in your team? A few questions just to wrap around those particular behavioral questions that were in the Excel-based survey I sent out. So I started on that journey, and what that meant was I started gathering data in a very specific way. I didn't give it much thought at the time. It was just a tool I needed to get the work done. Later on, though, I'd be extremely happy that I had a consistent format for gathering data because it would allow me 2 years down the road to start to do some research. And that's eventually what happened. But the journey was an amazing one, and I learned along the way how to apply some of these basic HPT concepts, but I also learned that there were some limitations in what we were doing. And they took a variety of shapes and forms, but I thought there's an opportunity here for this work to be more particular to Mars Incorporated. And when the time came that Leadership 2 was being developed, and we needed a framework, and we had all this data to look at, and someone said, hey, Carlos, look into the data, see what it tells you. And in the background, I'm thinking, wow, and there are these opportunities to do more. It all came together beautifully into what is now at the core of Leadership 2 and will expand even more broadly in the future. Well, it's, first of all, it was really clear that we were all being very polite with each other. That was the suspicion, I think, in 2002 or 2003 when we brought Gutman in, actually for the second time in our history. And I think we learned, yeah, we are. As a culture, we're spending a lot of time talking around issues and not really cutting to the chase. That was a validation of, I think, a strong sense that Paul, Michaels, and others had. It was at the same time that we were going through tremendous change in the business, bear in mind. So we were going through One US, or Power of One, elsewhere in the world. In the US, our experience was that that reorganization was upsetting. We were losing a lot of people. What's more, we finished the Power of One, or One US, and then within 18 months, we undid it. And we went to strategic business units, and I was involved in the change management for that process. And again, we were losing people. It was as if we were bleeding talent, and we were looking for things to hold on to people. So part of the thing, in the midst of all that difficulty, and this high-performing team process, no matter how you do it, if you really do it, it's demanding, because it insists you tell the blunt truth in a respectful way, but tell the truth to whoever needs to hear it and make sure you get clear with them. And it goes both ways, of course. But that kind of hard-hitting team intervention in the midst of all this change, there was a lot of pushback against it. People didn't want another reason to be uncomfortable, right? I think we learned another lesson there, which was you can do this, but you want to be smart about when and how. And you want to make sure that the connection to the real business need is clear, because I don't think people got that. I think people were more worried about, am I going to have a job or not, than they were worried about, am I telling Celia the honest truth today? So I learned a lesson about the importance, yes, I get it, we need to be straight with each other, and we need to really understand why it's important to do this. I think that was something, when we settled in after we got the SBUs, and then of course the Wrigley acquisition, we moved into segments, probably 2 years after all of that I just described. At this point, I was starting to do this work with teams, and I was looking to make sure when I worked with the team that they were crystal clear about why this was important, because it is tough. And you got to do it, but don't try to pretend that it's anything other than tough, and therefore have a very strong rationale for your people to participate and show up fully. I think the other thing we learned was how much demand there was for this. So we were doing this primarily with senior people, and Gutman still are a relatively small to moderate-sized firm, and there are only so many of these folks. And we realized, as I started to do this in 2008, I couldn't meet all the demand. It just wasn't going to happen. And we needed to somehow create bandwidth around this. It was working, and people wanted it, and what's more, can't forget engagement. We'd been working engagement for just a little bit less time than we had high-performing teams, and it is often the case that people, when they want to do an impact plan for their teams, want to work on their teams. Even more desire, therefore, for high-performing teamwork. I think we've learned, man, the demand is big, and I think this is how Mars U got into the game. And it's not just demand-driven. I think it's business-driven, too. Just like with engagement, we know it makes a difference. It's more efficient, it's more effective, and it's more engaging. So I think those are some of the key lessons we've learned. That link to engagement, which I've mentioned only in the last few minutes, critical. Yeah, there are a few of these discoveries. I'll never forget, I was working with a team in Hackettstown. It was one of our business management teams. This one is the filled bars team. Now this is a group that doesn't all report to the person who leads the team. It was a marketing person leading the team and a cross-functional group working with him or her, but not as direct reports. We got together, we were going to do a compressed session, a kind of team effectiveness session in just one day. Typically 2 days is recommended for an intact team, and for good reason. But we agreed to something we could do as a starter. And it was after lunch, I believe, and we had gone through a Myers-Briggs session. And I noticed people were all over the place. They were on their computers, they were on their phones, we were trying to get started. And it occurred to me to ask, after I had brought the group to order, why are you guys a team? I mean, I get that you need marketers and you need supply people and you need finance, but what specifically are you supposed to be doing as a team? And that brought them up absolutely short. Well, that's part of the problem. We don't really know what we're supposed to be doing. We know we all work on the same brands, right? It was filled bars, so Snickers and Milky Way and Three Musketeers, but we don't really know when we get together, what is it we're creating by being together? We're not sure. Boy, was that big for me. That question had been in the back of my mind, but had never formed, and in this room at that point, it was huge. And I began to think, wow, there's something to this. I don't think most of our teams ever go beyond each individual knowing what their job is. And in this kind of a setting, where you're in a cross-functional brand team or what's called segment team, arguing for your point of view because you're the supply guy or you're the finance lady, right? Argue for your point of view. There was no creation of a shared anything. And I thought, okay, that's something. And I began to actually play with that idea with teams. It didn't evolve until later, when we got into the research in 2009, into a full-blown part of a framework. But that was one big aha for me. And it sort of ate away at me for a while before I looked at the data and went, well, of course, teams aren't really figuring out how they create value as a team. And that idea, by the way, too, of value creation, I was working with a group of health professionals. They were basically nurses, right? And they're at our various sites. And I remember asking them the same question a few months later. It was in the spring of the following year. Why are you guys a team? I mean, I know what you do at your site. I get that. But I said, I want you to pause for a minute. Just imagine you're sitting in a chair, and Paul Michaels walks into the room. And gosh, I hope if Paul sees this, he doesn't mind my saying this, but I'm going to go put it out here anyway. And you're all sitting there with your salary, wages, and benefits number printed across your forehead. Now, Paul's a big fan of high-performing teams. I mean, Paul brought it in, as I mentioned earlier, right? So he gets it. And yet, what if he came into that room and saw all of our nurses sitting here when there were people out in the plants who might be getting injured? There could be health risks out there all over the place. You know, plants are dangerous places if you're not careful. And he could walk in and say, I'm looking at you, and I'm seeing what it's costing me to have you in this room. And I'm wondering, how do I get more value from you here in this room right now than I'd get from you if you were at the plant doing what I think at least a big part of your salary is there for? Help me understand how you actually create value by being together. It was very much in the moment, and I thought, you know what, that's really true. In terms of purpose, what teams really need to understand is how, by being together, they generate something new and of value for this business over and above what they generate, which they have to do on their own, doing their thing in their functional role, right? Big, big aha for me. I'm trying to think what the oh, you know what the other one was? And this had been bugging me for a while. There's a book out there called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. Patrick Lencioni, if you haven't read that one, you should. And it's used, and actually some folks use it in Europe. Some of our colleagues have used that approach. Trust is very big in that approach. Stephen Covey's book, The Speed of Trust. Trust was huge, and yet if you look at the approach we'd been using up till recently, we don't really talk about trust. We talk about candor, or straight talk, receptivity, and certainly if you're going to engage in those things, trust's going to come out of it, or it has to be an ingredient in it. I wasn't quite sure. And it forced me to think long and hard. I actually talked to a few GDS consultants about this. I said, you know, what do you do about this? It's not in the model, and people keep talking to me about it. They want to know what they feel there's a trust issue in their team. And to a certain degree, if we aren't talking to each other, having those candid must-have conversations, there's either low trust or low trust will result, right? I wasn't sure which and how it worked. And the point was, well, use the process and you'll get to the trust. Well, it wasn't quite working that way. And I started to think very deeply about teams and trust. And if you look at other models, for example, Korn Ferry Lominger has a teams model, the 7 T's. One of the words is trust. But I thought it needed more than don't worry, it'll take care of itself, or it's an, you know, it's the, what do we hear in the quotes? Trust is a residue of promises kept. Yeah, but how can you create an environment where trust is actually enhanced? And that was a big thought I was having as I was building this framework out of the data. What are the things we would need to put in place in our relationship that would, even if we didn't know each other well, tend to foster the outcome that is trust? It won't do everything, right? But it'll help us advance the cause of trust, which I think is a very organic thing. So that was the other part. So the thing about trust and purpose seemed close to me as well. I had a hunch that there was something big there. So there was that. I think those are probably for me until I get actually into the research, and we'll talk about that. Well, I think the biggest thing, so let me, we talk about the research a little bit in the process of presenting this. I want to talk about what it was like to do that. So I had all this data. I had all these interviews, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of quotes that I had typed out as I was talking to individuals, headset on, fingers tapping away. I had, in the survey database, there are 30 teams. So I had 30 sets of surveys. So each team, figure an average team is 7 to 8 people. Surveys from each individual, 30 teams, 7 to 8 people per team, do the math. Then I had interviews with each of those people. Each interview was 5 to 6 open-ended questions, my goal being to encourage them just to talk. And I actually dug into the interviews first. I had a little help. I dumped every Word document quote into a spreadsheet. And then I went through that spreadsheet and I started to say, okay, what's the topic of this quote? What's the topic of this quote? What's the topic of this quote? And I sorted them all into buckets, if you will. Quote, category, quote, category, quote, and then I sorted by category. And the most common thing that came out of this, you've heard already, which is one, we got a great team. Over and over again, people saying, we got the best people, we got the greatest people, we got the strongest people. Any which way you can find to express that idea, we got them. It was expressed. And the other side of it was the big but we aren't working together well. And I remember looking at that and just scratching my head thinking, how can on the one hand we have all these great people tell me they don't know how to work together well, fully aware that they should be doing it, but they're not? What's up with that? It was really, I mean, I had to stop and think. I was in my office, I was working out of my home that day, and I thought, you know what, that's just who we are, right? Our culture is hardworking, smart, productive people who know how to get the job done. We hire them, we reward them, we promote them, right? We do it. And I thought, no one's given me the charge to change our culture. And even if I wanted to, I couldn't. I was stuck. I was absolutely thinking, I'm just going to have to call back my colleagues at Mars U and say, what the data's telling me, I can't do anything with. And I remember writing, or I can't remember what I was doing, writing or thinking aloud, and I thought, you know, it's like we're stuck, it's like gravity. You just can't argue with gravity. What are you going to do about it? And this is that aha moment that led to the image we used throughout the program, which was, well, hold on a second. I get around, I fly, I travel a lot to go to these teams. Airplanes get off the ground despite the fact that, that gravity would like them to stay there. There's got to be some analogous situation for this. There's got to be a way to take this hard-charging, results-focused way of being and release it. Release all that energy towards the team. The word aerodynamics popped into my mind. It didn't do me much good because that's just a scientific word for how you generate lift. But I started playing with this idea of an airplane, and then it's when it hit me. And this is deep background. Before I came to Mars, I spent 3 years working inside another company, and having been trained in the technologies, instrumentation, psychometric stuff of the Hay McBurr company, part of the Hay Group. But it's the Hay Group's leadership division. One of the founders of Hay McBurr was a guy named David McClelland, who had done basic research in motives. And McClelland asserted there were three motives that were really relevant to work. A lot of other models had more. McClelland said, look, when it comes to work, there are 3 that matter: achievement, affiliation, and power. Achievement being a deep, abiding interest in getting things done. That's us. Second, affiliation. It's just a deep motivation for connecting with others and being friendly. Well, that we didn't see. We have friendly people, but it wasn't a lot about relationships, right? And third, power. And that's around influence and getting things done through others. Our achievement motive is really high at Mars, using the McClellan model. It's like out of balance. And it's so strong that even, pause for a minute. If you look at the MLCs now, down there in the lower left-hand side is delivers consistent results. That's all about achievement. We're great at that. The other side creates collaborative relationships. We're not doing that so well. But what if we could take that strong drive to achieve and somehow create enough of a sense within the team that the team was something to achieve, that collaboration was something to achieve, that we could actually direct all that energy for getting stuff done towards the idea of collaboration. That was the vague idea I had. Turn collaboration into a point of achievement. To do that now, you have to think back to some of these other things I talked about. First of all, I'll never do that. High individual achieving Mars associate, I'll only pay attention to what's really clear to me. So if my team isn't clear about why it's together, so I'm going to go to that meeting, my group, we're all sitting around the table at our meeting. I know what I have to do, and I'm not sure what this team is here to do. So what am I going to do? Pop open my computer, start typing, doing my emails, writing the PowerPoint presentation I have to take to the general manager next week because I know what I got to do. We have to be, I realize teams have got to get absolutely clear about why they exist. And what's more, it has to be so real that you can define the values because people will react to that. That achievement motive will go, oh, I see. So if we're doing these things, that feels rewarding to me innately because I love achievement. That's thing one. And that comes right out of the data. And all of a sudden, I've got my wings, right? There's the gravity of individual achievement, but the wings of clear reasons to collaborate. I'll do that, if that makes sense to me. So not just purpose then you got to be clear about, look, we got commitments to this business. One of the things I learned, forget even looking at the data, but time and time again when I would ask teams, what are your top strategic priorities? What are the top 3 to 5 things you got to achieve? Team members would be all over the place. Very low levels of agreement, very typically. Team purpose, and then something around clarifying our shared intention so we know what we ought to be collaborating on and what will be held accountable to collaborate on. These things, once those became clear to me, then I said, oh, okay, I get it. Again, take that achievement drive, set up your team in such a way as it will draw the attention of that achievement focus and get it focused on the team instead of on the self. Now you have to do both, right? We can't stop contributing as individuals. We have to be able to demonstrate our worth on an individual level, but now we start to channel that energy into the team. Once I had those 2 pieces in place, it was just a question of then we get back to this collaborate. We don't collaborate well, Carlos. Remember that message we heard from the data? Great. Now that we know why we're a team and what we're collaborating on, let's sit down and just have some specific, clear conversations about it. And it grew from there. So we had the first 3, and then you realized, well, if you're going to do that, you better have some governance in place, some ways of working. That was just logical. By the way, we know as Martians we don't like process very much. So we have to be very smart about that. But the good news is clear team purpose, clear shared intent. I'm more likely to do what it takes to keep this thing running, right? My attention gets drawn to that. And finally, learning. Ongoing learning was going to have to be part of this because stuff changes too fast at Mars, I suspect, in any company. So we add that 5th component to the framework. But it was that aha moment for me around it's our culture, and guess what? If we do it right, we can actually turn it to our advantage. Seems to be working. Well, first of all, the research is pretty solid, and we had a good size sample size to work from. So the research came from the right size population. The methodology for analyzing the data, I did a lot of this in previous jobs, so I know that's sound. I think there are a couple of things we did. First of all, I spent a lot of time looking outside Mars, looking at other companies and looking at the best books on the subject by the people I admired in the field, including, by the way, the folks from Gutman, right? So we did that. The research had this internal and external component. What do we know about ourselves? What do we know about the outside world? So my data gathering was not just on our teams, but on teams outside of Mars, the team theories and concepts. Then I moved into what I call the development phase. I said, now, all this data is suggesting a model, and I've described that process to you. It's suggesting a certain set of consistent things we need. And then I looked at the outside world, and there could be, for example, as I said earlier, certain models are overt about trust. There's a trust piece. Did we need that or not? Thinking about our culture and how we worked. So in the development phase, I looked at our stuff. It very neatly fell into some buckets, especially as I looked at the electronic survey. And I tried to link that up with the external concepts to develop a model that seemed credible. And then I took that model on the road. First, I took it to my Mars U colleagues and some P&O colleagues, and I said, does this make any sense? I think actually you were one of the people who saw it in the very early stages, Celia. And I attended a really interesting conference where a number of folks from the military, which is, as you can imagine, is very big in teams, and Harvard, some absolute lights in the field of team and group theory were there. And I actually pulled a couple of them aside, 3 of them. And I said, I want to show you something. And I said, here's the basic model, here's what it means. Well, first of all, they thought I was nuts. They didn't think I was nuts. They actually thought Mars was crazy, because they thought that corporations don't do this. Corporations do not develop their own team frameworks. You can go buy one off the shelf. And I said, yeah, we tried that. It didn't work so good. And to a person, these people said, man, you know, if what you're telling me about your research is right, certainly these 5 elements seem essential to a good team. As you describe your culture, send it to me. So I sent them the decks. I also sent it to some folks at CCL. So we had the experts validate this. And then once we got that clear, and we had a bunch of Mars people and non-Mars people look at this, then I took it on the road. In February of 2011, we modified our data gathering instrument. We modified the program. We set aside any other frameworks and said, this is what we're using, let's see how it goes. And from February right up until the present, now 9 months later, 8 months later, we've tested it, refined it. There have been some changes made, but the fundamental assumptions, even up to today, when I introduced this to a bunch of senior P&O folks in Europe, people look at it and go, that's us. That's what we need to spend our time on. So I am feeling very confident that we've got a model that serves us as well as comes from us. And those I work with seem to have that same level of confidence. We're really excited about the possibilities here, and I think we've been rigorous in assuring that what we've got will work. Well, a couple of things. First of all, the first time I worked with a team outside the U.S. was with a Wrigley team in China. And I'd already started to formulate these thoughts around purpose and trust, and too around cultivate collaboration and getting people talking to each other about where they need to connect. And I remember preparing for China through my phone interviews, and the language issues were very much present. And I thought, this is going to be tough, especially when we get to the part where we talk to each other and we do some feedback. I was blown away, I guess is the only way to say it. I got over there and we got into this session, and these guys, a big team, 14 people, big country, so you'd expect that. They jumped in with both feet. They were so ready and so excited to have a chance to really understand why they were working together. They became one of my best clients, so to speak. I've been over there 3 times with them now, and then worked with a couple of the related teams in the Asia-Pac region. And that's a culture, you don't get much different from North American culture than Chinese culture, for a lot of reasons. And I did my homework on this, and what I'll tell you, in this instance, I think the consistencies in culture, and I want to talk about that, overarched any differences in culture in terms of who we are as a corporation, Mars/Wrigley. What I learned was I underestimated their interest, desire, and commitment to do this. It was my bad, right? they were all over it, and they continue to be. And in Europe, it's worked equally well. I've been in Poland, I've been in Germany, I've been in France, in the UK, and we find that these concepts are playing extremely well. When I say playing well, I mean people resonate with it. As I say, the thing I'll hear most often is, I see us in that. I see why that's a Mars model. That makes sense to me. So I'm pretty comfortable with it. As I was constructing this model, it was clear to me that this model would live within Mars alongside another model. Yeah? I wasn't creating a model to displace what we'd done with Gutman. That's working too well. You just don't cut off your nose to spite your face. So I thought, what I have to do is take this information that really has risen up out of the data. I did very little but shape it. And I have to put it together in a way that is complementary to this other approach. So what I noticed about our approach with the 8 attributes, for example, is that it is descriptive. It says, here's what a high-performing team looks like. These are the optimal behaviors. Now, by the way, we have similar behaviors embedded in the MLCs under Creates Collaborative Relationships. So as I studied those, I thought, well, what we need is, well, my experience has been that those descriptors are good, but deeper in the organization, people are less clear about how they should be, right? And I thought it's not a question of what it looks like, but how we get there. So if you look at the framework, start with inspire purpose. What I wanted to do was make it an action, a thing to do. Now, it could have been create purpose, but it was also important that the purpose be inspiring. If you look at the literature on purpose, and there are a couple of great books out there, it's all around connecting to people, hearts and minds. And so for each one of them, you'll see a verb and the action. So inspire, purpose. I guess that's a verb and a noun. You'll see crystallize, intent. So we want to get very clear, so clear it sparkles like a crystal, our intention, and so forth. These are action words. So the framework is more prescriptive, if you will, versus descriptive. And that's where we come up with these words around inspiring purpose, crystallizing intent, cultivating collaboration. I mean, that is a very evocative verb, to cultivate, right? I wanted leaders to look at this and go, I see what I need to do, right, at a high level, and so forth. And that's the origin of why we named it the way we named it. The first 2 pieces of the framework, inspire purpose and crystallize intent. For me, and you'll see this word come up sometimes in some of what I've talked about and written about, it establishes the team's identity together. A team with an identity has the power to draw people's attention and focus for achievement. That's why we need that. There's a real important interplay between those two. And when you work purpose, you'll bleed over a little into intent. And when you're working intent, you'll bleed it back a little, and that's okay. We have to be careful not to be too, to force these divisions too strongly, right? What we want is a strong sense of clarity of team identity, something that each and every one of our team members can relate to on a personal, gut, heart level. So that's one of the most important things. Secondly, what was clear to me first as I was letting this model emerge from the data was that people were not being intentional about their collaboration with each other. In other words, the complaint was, Carlos, we just aren't collaborating enough. And in the back of my mind, I was thinking, well, just sit down with your colleagues and figure out how you're going to do that. Now, of course, without purpose and intent, we don't really know why, but I think that idea of cultivating collaboration came to me early on because that's where the pain was. It was only to support that. And then as I looked at the data around clear team, I think I used words like mission back then, clear team mission and clear strategic priorities. Those two would help that, but that really was the first, that bit formed the center of the model as I developed it. Does that make sense? Right? Then the ways of working on the back end, really, that's in the survey data, as I've suggested. Teams are not very attentive to their efficiency as a team. And they were saying, Carlos, our meetings are not good, and we don't have things in place to learn from what we've done, so this whole thing around learning and process, they form like bookends for this idea of intentional collaboration. We call it cultivate collaboration, but in my head originally it was intentional collaboration. And so you got purpose, intent, you've got learning and process. They sort of hug this thing and create this environment where collaboration really begins to thrive. Those are some of the more subtle interconnections. One other thing I want to say is the consistently lowest scoring survey item, there were 20 items in that version of the survey, was this thing about team learning. We don't stop and take learnings from either how we're acting as a team or the projects we work on. Just way, way down there. The verbals were all around not collaborating. The survey was all around not learning. So you can start to see how some of these pieces fit together. It has a long history that predates the current framework. It started when I started working on high-performing teams in July of 2008. I needed something. So I went back to something I had developed almost a year earlier when I started working somewhat casually with teams. And I begged, borrowed, and stole. I took things from here, I took them from there. I'm very much about behavior. So it was 15 or 20 behavioral items. Actually, it started as 22. And I took that, and in July of that year, because I had this agreement with GDS not to gather data in their way, I said, well, here are 20 I think that relate to teams and to these 8 attributes and the 4 stages, and I just cobbled something together. Over time, what I learned was, hear the survey, and I always did interviews, and I learned that the interview questions weren't lining up with the survey responses, so I was validating the survey. So there were several versions of that survey as I validated it real time. I had to build this airplane while I was flying it, right? Which I did. Eventually what we got to, as the model evolved, so as out of the research in 2009, I guess it was 2010? Out of the research in 2010, it became clear that we had these 5 practices. And I needed to look at that survey and say, what are the behaviors I will see when people are living those practices? And what are the attitudes and beliefs that they'll have about themselves and their teammates? What should they be looking for in each other, and what would I be looking for in them? And so it was modified yet again and ended up at about 25 questions. Each of the questions can be aligned to one of the 5 practices, right? And they're all either observable or things that people can easily report on about themselves. I feel this, I see that, sort of a thing. It's likely, as we continue to learn through 2011, to evolve just a bit more and to get more refined as we bring. I'm actually going to bring in some external expertise to help us with it, but what we use today has been really, really good. And it came out of earlier versions prior to the 5 practices and then being adapted and adjusted based on the 5 practices. I believe that digging deep into a team's purpose can change your life. I honestly believe that. When I challenge teams, and this is hard work because it seems so intangible. I've just seen some transformational things happen, and it's the story of the ice cream team I shared today with a group. In North America, we have an ice cream and substantial snacks group. We bought these 2 businesses within the chocolate business together. So you got big chocolate, if I can call it that, M&Ms and Snickers, right? And then you've got ice cream and substantial snacks. Now one management team running both. And we got together to talk about the team. And we tackled this question of purpose. And there was this general sense that I got through my interviews with them that we're the poor cousins. There's big chocolate and then we get all the leftovers. A real sense of we're not really valued and we don't know how to value ourselves. They did a simply brilliant job of finding a way to frame their team and their businesses that gave them a sense of pride and possibility. And I don't remember the exact words, and I don't have the entire statement in front of me. It goes on longer than this, but this I remember. We are entrepreneurial explorers in the brands beyond chocolate. Notice, it's not we're business people doing the stuff that nobody else wants to do, which is kind of the feeling they had. Entrepreneurial explorers in the brands beyond chocolate, as if to suggest that chocolate itself We've gone beyond just chocolate into something bigger and more powerful. The lights that went on in people's eyes and the sense that they had a really important thing to do together, it was magnified tremendously. And that's just one story, right? So I honestly believe if you're going to do one thing, sit down and we've got some tools for this. Ask yourself these deep probing questions and don't let up. Don't settle for, we're a world-class group of leaders who unlock the talent of our people. Anybody can say that, right? When it's really unique, entrepreneurial explorers in the brands beyond chocolate, there's only one group in the US that's going to be, right? Or probably anywhere in the world. But work hard, stick with it till you get it, be patient. It's an iterative process. It often takes 2 or 3 or 4 times through. Get the whole team involved, have some fun, play some games with it. But I do believe when you land on it, it'll change your life as a team. All this background stuff is interesting. I think as facilitators, they should be aware of the genesis of this model, where it comes from, what the research is all about, some of the challenges we faced in this. That's all contextual stuff. I'm a big N in Myers-Briggs. I know I need it. And my assumption is you're going to be stepping in front of a group of people who want to believe you know something about teams. You know that stuff. Keep it in the background, right? Better to bring in your own experience. Most of the folks who are going to be facilitating this have probably worked with groups in one way, shape or form. Think about your own experiences and start to frame them up in terms of this framework. Have your own stories to tell about purpose, for example. Look, there are a lot of us, you may call it visioning, whatever. Adapt your stories to illustrate your connection to the material. That's going to make all the difference. I mean, we've learned this going through this process together. We could sit here and go blah, blah, blah about the theory all day. And you know what? At the end of the day, what folks want to do is they want real-world experiences that they can then translate so they can apply it to their own teams, their own jobs, and get to that part quickly and bring the richness of your own life along on the journey.